Nate was an experienced hiker, familiar with the Rockies trails even in harsh conditions. His destination was a cabin he'd rented for a week, a place so remote it wasn't on most maps. The journey was harder than expected. The snow was deeper, the air colder, and the silence heavier than usual. By the second day, unease began creeping in. The woods felt strange, as if watching him. Twice he stopped, swearing he'd heard faint laughter, but when he turned, there was nothing. When he finally reached the cabin, it was smaller than the photos had suggested, its weathered exterior barely holding against the elements. Snow covered the windowsills, and the door groaned on its hinges when he pushed it open. Inside was sparse, a cot, a wood stove, and a table scarred with knife marks. The walls bore strange carvings, symbols he didn't recognize. They spiraled and looped in unsettling ways, as though drawn by a trembling hand. Nate brushed off his discomfort, chalking it up to an eccentric previous occupant, and set about making the space livable. As night fell, Nate was woken by a sound, a soft crunching outside, deliberate and slow. Sitting up in the dark, he strained his ears. It wasn't an animal. The footsteps were too steady, too human. He grabbed his flashlight and edged toward the frosted window, his breath fogging the glass. Peering out, he saw nothing but the vast white. His stomach churned. Was someone out there? He shouted, "Hello?" But the sound felt flat, absorbed by the snow. Silence followed, thick and oppressive. The next morning, he found tracks circling the cabin. They were human footprints, but oddly spaced, as if the person who made them had an unnatural gait. The snow inside the prints had melted slightly, refreezing in sharp edges, almost claw-like. Nate followed the trail a few hundred yards before they disappeared into the forest. A cold dread gripped him. Whoever was out here shouldn't be. He resolved to leave the next day, cutting his trip short. That night he locked the door and barricaded it with the table. He built the fire high and sat close to the warmth, knife in hand. Outside, the footsteps returned, circling once more. Then came a knock, soft but deliberate. Nate froze. The knock came again, harder this time, as if impatient. His flashlight flickered in his trembling hand. "Who's there?" he shouted. The response was laughter high, strange, and echoing as if more than one voice was mocking him. The firelight danced erratically as the door rattled. Suddenly it stopped. Silence returned. Nate waited for hours, his heart racing, but there were no more sounds. At dawn, he ventured out, knife ready. The tracks were back, this time leading toward the forest. Against his better judgment, he followed. The footprints led to a cave hidden by thick pines. Its entrance yawned open like a mouth, dark and foreboding. Inside, the walls were covered in more carvings, glowing faintly as if alive. Nate's flashlight sputtered, the beam revealing piles of bones, animal and human. His stomach churned as a whispering filled the air, rising in a crescendo. It wasn't the wind. Figures emerged from the shadows, wearing masks of bark and bone, their movements jerky and unnatural. Nate backed away, but the figures closed in, their laughter a sickening echo. One lunged, and he swung his knife, connecting with a shoulder. The mask cracked, revealing not flesh, but something smooth and featureless beneath, like the surface of polished stone. The figure didn't flinch, reaching for him with clawed hands. Nate ran, his breath ragged, the snow slowing him as the masked figures pursued. The forest was alive now, the trees twisting unnaturally as if guiding him deeper into a trap. He stumbled, falling hard, and the figures surrounded him. Their laughter was deafening now, rising in pitch as they grabbed him, pulling him toward the cave. He clawed at the ground, screaming as they dragged him back to the entrance. Just before the darkness swallowed him, he caught sight of the carvings on the cave wall. They weren't symbols, they were faces. His own appeared last, etched in perfect detail, frozen in a scream. Max never thought much about the idea of being alone in the mountains. It was part of the appeal, just him, the snow, the wind, and the silence. He'd always sought the peace of the backcountry, far from the crowd, away from the noise. But on that particular day, the peace was shattered by a misstep, a sharp crack, and the sudden realization that the mountains weren't as serene as he'd believed. His snowboard had twisted beneath him in a way it shouldn't, and he felt his leg snap. The pain was immediate, raw, and excruciating. He couldn't move. His body refused to comply, the snow beneath him suddenly feeling colder, sharper. It took him a few moments to breathe, to process what had happened, to understand the severity of the situation. The silence was oppressive now, the only sound his own labored breathing. He tried to stand, but quickly realized his leg wouldn't hold him up. The fracture was bad. He could see the angle of the bone through his pants. There was no way he could make it back to the lodge, no way to climb the distance back to the lift, and there was no one around to hear him if he screamed. He'd taken this route before, a side trail he knew well, but it was far enough off the beaten path that no one would come looking for him. Not unless he was overdue, which wasn't for a couple of days. No signal on his phone. His only option now was survival. First, he had to stop the bleeding, so he ripped off the sleeve of his jacket and tied it tight around his leg. The pain was overwhelming, but there was no time to focus on it. He took a deep breath and tried to conserve energy. There was still the hope, Slim, maybe, but hope that someone would notice he was missing. That's all he had to hold on to. With night closing in, he dug through his pack, pulling out the snacks he had. A couple of granola bars. Some water. It wasn't much, but he rationed it carefully, knowing it would have to last. The cold was unbearable, seeping into his bones, but he knew he couldn't risk falling asleep. Hypothermia would come before the rescue. His mind wandered to memories, to things he'd left behind. But he couldn't let it. Not now. Day after day he stayed put, the world outside growing darker. The sun came and went, and each new day brought with it a crushing reminder of his isolation. By the third day, his body had begun to betray him. His leg was swollen, the pain pulsing with every shallow breath. His strength was draining. He hadn't been able to keep his eyes open for long stretches, fighting off sleep that would leave him vulnerable. His world had become small, just him, the snow, the pain, the hope that someone might find him. Then, on the third day, the faintest sound cut through the stillness, the whup-whup-whup of a helicopter's blades. Max's heart leapt. He barely had the strength to call out, but he tried, his voice rough and weak. Over here! His breath was shallow, his body desperate for warmth, but the sound was growing louder. He kept his eyes locked on the sky, and then, there it was. A search and rescue chopper, hovering above him, its crew swiftly descending. It felt like a dream, a rush of relief so intense it made him dizzy. The rescue team reached him, their faces a blur of urgency, and he could hardly believe he was being pulled from the snow, his legs still screaming with pain, but his mind already racing through what was next. The chopper lifted him into the sky, the mountains shrinking beneath him as he closed his eyes, finally allowing himself to relax. He wasn't dead. He wasn't alone anymore. But the journey, the fight, had changed him. Not just in the way he moved, but in the way he saw everything. The mountains, the solitude, the fragile thread between life and death. He'd walked it and he'd survived. Amelia had been warned not to go into the mountains alone, especially in winter, but warnings were just noise to her. She was 22, independent, and determined to prove she could handle anything. When she left the trailhead that crisp morning, the sun reflected off the snow in dazzling brilliance, the air sharp with the scent of pine. Her plan was simple: hike a short route to a scenic overlook, spend the day photographing the frozen wilderness, and return to her car before nightfall. The first few hours went perfectly. The trail was well marked, the snow compacted from other hikers. Amelia marveled at icicles clinging to the rocky cliffs and the way the light refracted through the frost. Her camera clicked away, capturing moments of untouched beauty, but as she climbed higher, the trail thinned, and she began to notice signs of recent avalanches, broken branches, disturbed snow, and the eerie silence that hinted at danger. She pressed on, stubborn as ever, until she reached the overlook. The view was breathtaking, a panoramic display of jagged peaks in endless white. She lingered too long, engrossed in capturing the perfect shot. By the time she started back, the light had shifted, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. Amelia hadn't noticed the thin clouds rolling in, or how the wind had begun to pick up. A shortcut caught her eye, a side trail marked by faint tracks leading down a slope. She reasoned it would shave an hour off her return, and with the sun sinking, she took the risk. The snow here was loose, her boots sinking deeper with each step. She grew uneasy but pushed forward until the slope became treacherous. Then it happened. Her foot slipped on an unseen patch of ice and she tumbled forward. Her body collided with the slope, sliding uncontrollably down. The world spun as snow flew around her, the ground a blur of white and gray. She hit something hard, a rock maybe, and came to a jarring stop. Pain radiated from her ribs and leg, sharp and all-consuming. Amelia tried to move but couldn't. Her leg was pinned awkwardly, the ankle twisted unnaturally. Panic set in as she realized the shortcut had taken her into an isolated area. There were no other tracks, no sign of the main trail. She screamed for help, her voice swallowed by the vastness of the wilderness. The cold was immediate and unforgiving. She dug through her pack, finding her emergency blanket and wrapping it tightly around her trembling body. Her phone had no service, and her GPS blinked with a low battery warning. She activated the SOS beacon she carried, praying the signal would reach someone. The hours dragged on, and the cold crept deeper. Amelia tried to stay awake, fighting the pull of exhaustion. Her body betrayed her, trembling violently as her injuries sapped her strength. She thought of her parents, how she'd rolled her eyes when they'd begged her to stay safe. She thought of the friends she'd ignored, the warnings she'd dismissed. When night fell, the wilderness turned into an alien world. The wind howled through the trees, and strange shadows played on the snow. She thought she heard footsteps once heavy, deliberate, but when she shouted, no one answered. The dark pressed in on her, thick and unrelenting. By morning, Amelia's SOS beacon was dead. The sun rose weak and cold, offering no warmth. She tried again to crawl, but her injuries were too severe. Her breaths came shallow and ragged, each one a struggle. Snow began to fall, light at first but growing heavier. She closed her eyes against the sting of the flakes, her mind drifting in and out of consciousness. She dreamed of summer fields and warm sand, of laughter and light. She imagined herself back home, sitting by the fire with her parents, their faces kind and worried but safe. The warmth felt real, but as she opened her eyes again, she was met only by the blinding white of snow piling on her body. Amelia didn't hear the search team when they finally reached her. By then, the snow had almost hidden her entirely, her form just a faint outline in the drifts. The storm had erased her tracks, her story left to the wilderness. They found her camera, though, perfectly preserved in her pack. Its memory card held dozens of photos, stunning images of the mountains, the kind people hang on their walls to remind them of beauty. None of them showed the danger that had taken her, the way the mountains always keep their secrets. Klaus had not expected Texas to feel so empty. The road stretched on endlessly, surrounded by fields and woods that seemed to go nowhere. Snow fell heavily, a rarity in this part of the world, and it made everything feel wrong. His GPS had failed hours ago, and the map in his glove box was too outdated to be useful. Klaus had planned to arrive at a cozy inn for Christmas Eve, but now he was hopelessly lost on these desolate backroads. As dusk settled in, his headlights caught the shape of a house at the end of a narrow, unpaved driveway. Relief surged through him at the sight of the faint orange glow coming from one of the windows. A house meant people, and people meant help. He pulled his car onto the uneven gravel and parked near the front of the house. The house looked old, its wooden walls weathered and leaning slightly. Tools and odd trinkets hung from the porch beams, rusted saws, animal bones, and a jar filled with something unrecognizable. Klaus hesitated, a chill creeping down his spine, but he told himself it was just nerves. He knocked on the door, the sound echoing in the stillness. The door creaked open, revealing a man who filled the doorway with his size. His face was hidden behind a strange mask, stitched together from pieces of leather, or something that looked like leather. Klaus's stomach twisted, but he forced himself to speak. "Excuse me, I'm lost. Can you help me? Do you have a phone?" he asked, his voice tight with nervousness. The man didn't respond. Instead, he stepped aside, gesturing for Klaus to come in. Klaus hesitated. Every instinct screamed for him to get back in his car and leave, but the cold was biting and the snow was piling up fast. Against his better judgment, he stepped inside. The house was dimly lit, with only a single flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. The air smelled metallic and full, like rust and decay. Klaus's eyes darted around, taking in the strange items lining the shelves. Jars of cloudy liquid, tools caked with dark stains, and bones he couldn't identify. "Do you have a phone?" Klaus asked again, his voice trembling. The man didn't answer. Instead, he disappeared into another room, leaving Klaus alone. The house felt oppressive, as though the walls were closing in. Then he heard it, a low mechanical growl that sent a shiver through his entire body. A chainsaw. The sound roared to life, and heavy footsteps thudded toward him. Klaus's chest tightened as panic took hold. He ran to the door, but it wouldn't budge. His heart pounded as he grabbed a rusty metal rod from the nearest table, clutching it tightly. The man appeared in the doorway, the chainsaw roaring in his hands. Without thinking, Klaus swung the rod with all his strength. It struck the man's arm, and the chainsaw wavered, but the man didn't stop. Klaus bolted toward a window, shoving himself through the glass. The shards tore at his coat and skin as he landed in the snow, rolling to his feet. Pain shot through his ankle, but he forced himself to run. The chainsaw roared behind him, closer with every step. The snow blurred his vision, and his breath came in ragged gasps. He stumbled into the forest, the branches clawing at him like hands trying to pull him back. The chainsaw's growl echoed through the trees, a constant reminder that the man was right behind him. Klaus's ankle gave out, and he fell hard into the snow. Desperate, he crawled into a hollow at the base of a large tree. The sound of the chainsaw stopped, replaced by the crunch of heavy boots on snow. Klaus held his breath, his heart hammering in his chest. The footsteps came closer, pausing right outside his hiding spot. The man's shadow loomed over the hollow, but he didn't look down. After a long, agonizing moment, the footsteps moved away, fading into the distance. Klaus stayed frozen, too terrified to move, until the forest fell silent once more. By the time he crawled out, the snow had covered all traces of the chase. His car was gone, the driveway undisturbed, and the house was nothing but an empty patch of land. Klaus returned home to Germany, but the memories haunted him. Every Christmas Eve, he locked his doors and windows, unable to forget the sound of the chainsaw or the sight of that stitched mask. And in the quiet moments, he couldn't shake the feeling that the man was still out there, waiting for another lost traveler to knock on his door.
The frozen lake stretched endlessly, its surface a shimmering expanse of ice. The Foster family, Todd, Jenna, their teenage son Ryan, and young daughter Emily, had ventured deep into the wilderness for a weekend of ice fishing, eager for an escape from the city. Todd drilled holes into the ice while Ryan set the rods, his breath misting in the crisp air. Jenna unpacked their sled, pulling out a thermos of hot cocoa, and Emily spun in her snow boots, giggling as the snowflakes swirled around her. The isolation felt serene, the quiet broken only by the occasional crack of ice. But as they settled into their fishing spots, a deep, guttural roar erupted from the forested edge of the lake. All four froze. Todd stood, squinting toward the trees as a massive grizzly bear emerged, its fur frosted and its eyes wild. "That's not right," Todd muttered under his breath, his stomach sinking. Bears were supposed to be hibernating, but hunger must have woken this one early. It was gaunt, but no less dangerous, its heavy paws crunching through the snow. "Stay calm," Todd whispered, stepping in front of his family. Jenna pulled Emily close, her face pale. Ryan stood motionless, gripping his fishing rod as if it might help. The bear let out another low growl, its breath steaming as it locked its gaze on them. Todd raised his arms, shouting to make himself look bigger. "Get to the sled," he ordered, not looking back. Jenna hurried to the sled, dragging Emily and Ryan with her. Todd grabbed an ice rod, holding it like a spear as the bear took another step closer. His shouts did little to deter it. Suddenly, the bear lunged, swiping at Todd with a massive paw. He barely dodged, the force of the swing sending him sprawling on the ice. Jenna screamed as Todd scrambled up, his arm bleeding. "Run!" he yelled, waving at Jenna to take the kids. Ryan grabbed Emily's hand, pulling her toward the treeline on the opposite side of the lake. Jenna hesitated, torn between staying with Todd and protecting the children, but the bear charged again, forcing her to run. Todd swung the rod as the bear closed in, the flimsy pole snapping like a twig against its thick hide. Jenna didn't look back. Her legs burned as she ran, Ryan and Emily ahead of her, their small boots slipping on the ice. "Keep going," she urged. The forest loomed closer, but so did the sound of the bear's roaring fury. Behind her, Todd's screams cut through the frozen air, then fell abruptly silent. The three reached the treeline, ducking into the cover of the dense pines. The shadows closed around them, but there was no safety here. Jenna grabbed Ryan and Emily, pulling them into a hollow beneath a snow-laden tree. "Stay quiet," she whispered, her breath shaking. The forest was eerily still, the only sound their ragged breathing. A crack of branches shattered the quiet, and Jenna's heart sank as the bear's massive frame appeared among the trees. It moved slowly, sniffing the air, its hulking body blending into the snowy shadows. Jenna clutched a broken branch, holding it like a spear, and motioned for Ryan and Emily to stay hidden. She stepped into the open, trembling but determined. "Over here!" she yelled, waving her arms. The bear turned toward her, its dark eyes gleaming. Jenna didn't run. She couldn't risk leading it back to the kids. Instead, she stood her ground, gripping the branch tightly as the bear charged. Its massive weight crashed into her, knocking her to the ground. Pain flared through her as claws tore into her jacket, but she swung the branch wildly, fighting with every ounce of strength she had. Her screams echoed through the forest, cutting off abruptly. Ryan and Emily huddled in the hollow, tears streaming silently down their cheeks. The bear's growls faded into the distance, leaving only the sound of the wind. The siblings clung to each other, knowing they were truly alone. The snow had been falling steadily for hours, covering the narrow mountain road in a deceptive blanket of white. Casey didn't want to make the drive, but the holiday plans at her family's cabin had been set for weeks, and her mother's voice over the phone had been insistent. "You're a good driver. Just take it slow." Casey had taken it slow, carefully winding up the treacherous path. Her old sedan groaned in protest against the incline, tires slipping now and then on the icy patches. She gripped the wheel tightly, her nerves already frayed from the storm. Everything was white, the road, the trees, the sky, making it impossible to tell where the ground ended and the sheer drop began. She missed a curve, just slightly. The car skidded, the tires losing all traction as she yanked the wheel in panic. Gravity took over, dragging her toward the edge. The sedan tipped, balanced for a sickening second, and then plunged into the abyss. The car struck trees and boulders on its way down, tumbling end over end before slamming to a stop against a jagged outcrop. Casey's body was flung forward, the seatbelt biting into her ribs as the airbag deployed with brutal force. The impact left her dazed, her vision blurred by pain and shock. When she came to, the world was unnervingly quiet. The car was ruined, its hood crumpled like a piece of paper, the windshield a spiderweb of cracks. Casey's legs were pinned under the dashboard, and blood trickled down her temple, warm against the freezing air. She tried to move, gasping as sharp pain exploded in her ribs and hips. Her breaths came shallow, each one a battle against the tight band of agony squeezing her chest. For a long moment, she sat there, tears freezing on her cheeks as reality settled in. No one knew where she was. Her phone was on the passenger seat, the screen shattered. She tried to reach for it, but her arms felt like lead, her fingers clumsy and weak. With a grunt of effort, she managed to pull it toward her, only to discover it wouldn't turn on. Darkness began to fall, the temperature dropping with it. Casey forced herself to move, each tiny shift sending fire through her body. She had to get out. She couldn't die here. Her hands fumbled with the seatbelt, trembling as she released the latch. It took everything she had to push the door open, the cold slapping her in the face as the wind rushed in. The snow was deep, swallowing her up to her knees as she staggered out of the car. Her legs wobbled beneath her, threatening to give out entirely. She clutched at her side, every step sending shockwaves of pain through her body. The slope was steep, the ground uneven and slippery. Casey climbed. Slowly, agonizingly, she clawed her way up the incline, slipping back more often than she advanced. Her breaths were labored, the world spinning with every move. Blood seeped through her clothes, staining the pristine snow. She didn't know how long she struggled, only that the sky had turned an inky black by the time she reached a flatter stretch of land. She collapsed there, shivering uncontrollably, her strength completely spent. The stars above were clear and cold, distant in their beauty. She thought of her family, of her mother's voice, of the warm cabin waiting for her somewhere beyond the darkness. Casey forced herself to her feet again, staggering forward, her steps uneven. She couldn't feel her hands or feet anymore, the frostbite spreading like an invisible predator. Her vision was narrowing, black edges creeping in as her body reached its limit. When she finally fell, she didn't get back up. The snow cradled her like a soft, frozen bed, her breath misting weakly in the air. She stared at the stars, tears slipping free as her body began to surrender. In those final moments, there was no fear, just a strange, fragile peace. The cold wrapped around her like a blanket, and the pain ebbed away. Derek trudged through the snow-covered wilderness, his pack heavy on his back and his boots crunching against the frozen ground. He had been hiking the mountain trail for days, savoring the solitude and the stark beauty of the winter landscape. The forecast had warned of worsening weather, but Derek, confident in his experience, had pushed forward. By the time the snow began to fall heavily, obscuring the trail and muffling the world around him, he knew he needed to find shelter. The mountainside offered little protection, just jagged rocks and towering trees, until he spotted the dark mouth of a cave nestled into the craggy rock face. It wasn't ideal, but it would shield him from the storm. With numb fingers, he clambered inside, his headlamp illuminating the rough, uneven walls and the low ceiling. The cave smelled damp and earthy, the air heavy with an unsettling silence. Derek pushed his unease aside, setting up his small camp just a few feet from the entrance, careful to keep the cold wind at bay while staying close enough to flee if necessary. As he unpacked his gear, the storm outside grew fiercer, the wind howling like a living thing, driving the snow into an impenetrable white wall. Derek tried to relax, boiling water for his freeze-dried meal and wrapping himself in his sleeping bag for warmth. But just as he began to drift off, a thunderous roar shattered the stillness. He sat up, heart pounding, as the ground beneath him trembled violently. The sound grew louder, closer, until it was deafening. Derek barely had time to register what was happening before a wall of snow and debris slammed into the cave entrance, sealing it shut in an instant. Darkness swallowed him, the faint light of his headlamp barely cutting through the suffocating blackness. He scrambled to his feet, panic clawing at his chest as he threw himself against the packed snow, digging and clawing desperately. It was no use. The avalanche had left no gaps, no mercy, and the cold, hard weight pressed back against him as if the mountain itself had decided to trap him. Breathing hard, Derek stepped back, his mind racing. He tried to calm himself, reminding himself that he had survived worse. He had supplies, a headlamp, and time. At least, that's what he told himself. He rationed his food and water carefully, lighting his small camp stove for brief moments of heat, but the oppressive darkness and silence began to work against him. The cave felt alive, the faint dripping of water from the icy stalactites above echoing like a heartbeat. Days passed, or at least he thought they did. Without sunlight, time became meaningless, and the weight of his isolation bore down on him. His breath formed clouds in the freezing air, each one a countdown to the depletion of oxygen in the sealed space. He began talking to himself, first to plan, then to stay sane. "Someone will come," he whispered, his voice small and cracked. "They'll notice I'm missing." But as the hours stretched on, doubt crept in like the cold seeping through his layers. He thought he heard noises, footsteps, whispers, but every time he turned his head, there was nothing but the relentless dark. Exhaustion and hunger gnawed at him, his strength fading with each passing moment. His headlamp flickered, the battery nearing its end, plunging him into deeper despair. Derek tried digging again, using his camp tools to scrape at the snow and ice, but his movements grew sluggish, his fingers too numb to grip. The air felt thinner now, every breath a struggle. He slumped against the cave wall, his body shaking from the cold and the realization that no one was coming. As the last light of his headlamp sputtered out, Derek closed his eyes, the darkness complete. He thought of the open trails, the crisp winter mornings, and the friends he'd promised to call when his hike was done. His body grew heavy, his mind drifting between dreams and reality, until the cold claimed him at last.